Namaste. Amen, and blessed be. In the beginning was the Word. Out of the swirling chaos there emerged a presence. Once, long, long ago in this place, a great turtle dove down into the depths. For the month of October, we're focusing on the theme of creation in our worship at Tapestry. Now, most of us know the Christian story of creation, of God creating heaven and earth in 7 days, and Adam and Eve and their travails. And of course, we know that most Unitarian Universalists are invested in the Big Bang. But what about the time when out of the swirling chaotic waters, Atum willed himself into being and then spat out a son, Shu, god of the air. Atum then vomited up a daughter, Tefnut, goddess of moisture. These two were charged with the task of creating order out of chaos. Shu and Tefnut generated Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. Or at least that's the story of how it all began from an Egyptian perspective. There are countless stories like these. Some are wonderfully fantastic, others are a lot simpler. But they all answer the very question of where did we come from? As long as we have experienced awe and wonder, we human beings have offered different stories for our beginning. We call them creation myths. Nearly every society has one. It's always a rich story. It's so powerful that it continues to be passed down generation to generation. Now, they're not typically understood literally. They aren't seen as a detailed description of the way it all happened. They're metaphors for the source of life and the way a community understands itself. Creation myths hold profound truths for every society. They tell them where they came from and, more importantly, the way things should be. So today we're going to look at a few different creation myths and the way they correspond with a broader culture. That's why I was drawn to that familiar reading that we used this morning. I think I used it a couple of months ago. I try not to do that. If there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in the nations. If there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. If there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the home. If there is to be peace in the home, there must be peace in the heart. I chose this reading, first of all, because it demonstrates the logical order of thought. Now, theology operates much the same way, sort of like Russian nesting dolls. One belief has to fit neatly with the next. And origin stories work the same way. They deeply impact the rest of a culture's understanding. Now, the other reason I chose this reading is that it's a great window into Taoism, both the creation myth and the way it's impacted Chinese culture for 2,000 years. That very popular reading comes from Lao Tzu. We don't know a lot about his life, but we do know that he lived around 600 before the Common Era. More than creating this reading that's so common in our country, he was the author of the Tao Te Ching and the creator of Taoism, the predominant religious tradition within China. What I was fascinated to learn this week is the way that the origin myth of Taoism fits so neatly with the rest of the philosophy of Chinese culture. There's another reading in our hymnals. It's number 606, and it's titled The Tao. It talks about the beginning of it all. It's not a myth in the sense of a story with characters, but it talks about the beginning, the source of being. You're welcome to read along with me, but I'm going to go ahead and read through it quickly for you. It says, "Before creation, a presence existed, self-contained, complete, formless, voiceless, mateless, changeless, which pervaded itself with unending motherhood. Though there can be no name for it, I've called it the way of life. Perhaps I should have called it the fullness of life, since fullness implies widening into space, widening still further, implies widening until the circle is whole. In this sense, the way of life is fulfilled, heaven is fulfilled, earth is fulfilled, and a fit person is also fulfilled." Now, the sense of concentric circles in both of these readings from Lao Tzu is striking. It's just like those Russian nesting dolls. That's how creation happened. Now, shortly after the time of Lao Tzu, another Chinese philosopher came along named Confucius. We probably don't know a lot about him, but you no doubt know that name. Confucius devised a system of interdependent relationships, a structure where lower levels give obedience to higher levels, and that extended from the family out into wider governmental and national levels. As a result, Chinese culture gives a considerable amount of reverence for authority and age. In a sense, it's egalitarian, not in a Western way, but it's egalitarian because everyone on that same level understands themselves to be equal. The point is that Chinese culture very much respects a chain of command. As the Tao expands in concentric circles to heaven, then earth, then to people, so too our social relationships expand in concentric circles. And the arrangement of power, the order of society, rests in honoring these expansive circles of authority and respect. It stems from an understanding of the origin of creation. Pretty interesting stuff. In a very different way, Buddhism uses a question of creation to reinforce one of its most central doctrines. Now, Buddhism is a lot like Unitarian Universalism in a way. It's not based on religious doctrine, it's more sort of a philosophy and a lifestyle. So as it spreads out, it takes on the specific culture of wherever it lands. But in the midst of that great diversity between Zen Buddhism in Japan or Tibetan Buddhism, in the midst of all that diversity, there's a core principle that hinges on the question of where we come from. It's not a creation myth so much as a philosophical exercise. It's called the doctrine of dependent origination. It's reminiscent of that classic childhood line of questioning, why? To each answer there remains a question. We've all been sucked down that rabbit hole by a child at some point or another. But the doctrine of dependent origination is much the same. Only rather than asking why, one asks the question of origin. What's the source of that thing or that person in the world? From what? From what? From what? So thinking of myself, I'm called to ask the question, from what? I'm a body and a mind, emotions and thoughts, actions and history. Each one of those components is made up of many different things. My body, I guess, breaks down into organs, and I would have to consult someone, but I think carbon and water mostly at the end of the day. Emotions and thoughts, that's a little more complicated. There's a physical component to them in my brain, but also experience upon experience has developed them. As we ask, from what, the identity of self slowly dissolves. And eventually we come to realize that all things, even those things that we most desire in the world, and those things that we most despise, all things are infinitely divisible. The origins of them are dependent. And more importantly, what we see as separation between us and them is an illusion. And so the highest aim in Buddhist life is cultivating compassion and living with a sense of compassion. After all, if there's no division between me and you, then I should be just as attuned to your joys and your difficulties as my own. And I should strive to alleviate your suffering just as much as my own, because we come from the same source. The doctrine of dependent origination, or the relentless asking of the question, from what, helps Buddhists with one of their fundamental senses of compassion and interconnection. Now, I want to talk about one last religious tradition and its creation myths. This is probably the most straightforward one. There's a great variety of belief among Native American peoples, but their origin stories have some very strong similarities. The type of origin stories that most tribes adhere to creates among them a particular culture that's very different from European Americans' understanding of land and space and home. The understanding of place cuts to the core difference between Western and American Indian cultures. A good deal of that difference has to do with the myth of where it all began. Now, we're familiar with that Genesis story of God creating Adam and Eve in the garden and sending them out from the garden afterwards to roam and explore the earth. It's a particular kind of story that yields a particular relationship with land. But for Native American cultures, creation happens in a very different way. Like I said, there's a great deal of diversity among them, but there are two core types of creation myths. One is an emergence story. In these stories, humanity emerges from another world into the one they currently inhabit. The previous one was often considered the womb of the earth, and the process of emergence is much like the earth giving birth to a people. But what's important about that is that the people emerge in a specific location. This group of people is here because in ancient times, this is where they emerged from the earth. This is where their existence began, in one spot. The other common type of creation myth among Native American communities is an earth diver myth. I mentioned that turtle in my first opening sentences. In these stories, there's usually an animal that swims down to primal waters and collects sand and mud and twigs and begins to build up land for people. But the important thing about that is it's a specific piece of land, a specific spot. It's a particular place. Now, we Unitarian Universalists celebrate the earth as sacred. It sustains our lives. But for American Indians, the earth is sacred in a different way. It's not only sacred in that sort of abstract Mother Earth way that we embrace. It's sacred because it's the specific place where a people came into being. It's a specific location where a community belongs and is able to flourish. Now, this sense of location and rootedness stems directly from the type of creation myth they embrace. These stories of the beginning are incredibly powerful. We've heard a few different creation myths from different cultures today. They're each very different, and they serve to create a patchwork of beliefs, or nesting dolls. But there aren't just 4 or 5 stories. There aren't even hundreds of stories. I think there are billions of creation stories, because each of us have our own. We each came into this world in a particular way, in a mixture of pain and hope, struggle and light. And just like the creation stories of the universe, these are stories that we can't confirm firsthand. Sure, there are birth certificates, but we certainly don't remember what was happening the day we were born. What time of day it was, what kind of emotions flooded the room, what kind of joy emerged, what was the struggle. We have to take someone else's word for what it was like, and we get the story passed down to us. For some of us, there's no story passed down at all. For those who are adopted or for some reason separated from their family of origin, that story of creation is never told. And so we make one up. When you don't know the story of where you come from, you eventually make one up. It's too big of a question for us to leave blank. If there's no explanation provided, no story of creation, then we will patch together what little information we have to come up with some reason for our existence in the world. We need a story. We need the story. These creation stories, both the stories of how we came into the world as individuals and the story of how the universe came into being, are very powerful. Now, hopefully, I've demonstrated to you how they influence cultures, how their understanding of where they came from influenced their experience in the world. Stories get passed down from generation to generation, and with each retelling, they become more ingrained, and they shape the way a community sees itself. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to deal more directly with Unitarian Universalist understandings of the world and how it began. But before we do that, I want to encourage you this week to think about your own creation myths, both for your own life and for the existence of the universe. We've seen today that beliefs about the beginning impact an entire network of beliefs, whether it's Buddhism or Taoism or American Indians. So I leave you with a question this week. How do your creation myths inform your beliefs? How do your stories of the universe impact the way you think and feel about the world? How does the story of your birth impact the way you see yourself? And do you want to rewrite any of those stories? Amen. I'd like to invite our ushers to come forward. A couple of weeks ago, I started sharing